Bonjour, good afternoon. Mon nom est Daniel Bélan, je suis le directeur de l'Institut d'études canadiennes de McGill. We are really glad to have you this afternoon for our winter Eakin Lecture. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important to us at MISC to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. We encourage everyone here today to seek out more spaces for learning and understanding the history of these territories. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, which is known as MISC, is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues that are important to understand the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as the wonderful talk you're attending today. And these public events, are really on a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians. And if you want to learn more about our institute, you can go to our website at mcgill.ca/misc, M-I-S-C. So, today, of course, we welcome you to this Eakin Lecture. I would like to take a minute to thank the Eakin family, whose support enriches the study of Canada at McGill and makes possible these annual lectures. We have actually normally two MISC Eakin Fellows who come, normally one in the fall, one in the winter, although sometimes we have someone who can come for the entire year. And these Eakin Fellows, and we have one of them in the room with us today, will speak, come and they teach a class here at McGill in Canadian Studies, and they also do research, and they make this presentation, this Eakin Lecture, as part of their stay at McGill. The Eakin Visiting Fellowship in Canadian Studies was established by the Eakin family in memory of William R. Eakin. The fellowships are awarded each term to active scholars whose research or teaching advances Canadian studies. MISC is very grateful to the Eakin family, and we have Gail Eakin who's here today. Hello, Gail. And we are really grateful to their support and for the opportunities afforded by these fellowships. And now, j'ai le grand plaisir de vous présenter non seulement un collègue, mais un ami, quelqu'un qui est très réputé ici au Canada en sciences politiques, mais aussi dans son domaine de recherche plus spécifique en matière de politique sociale notamment. I'm now pleased to introduce the visiting Eakin Fellow at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada this semester, Michael Orsini. You can come here. Michael is a professor in the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies and the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa, which is basically, Ottawa is a suburb of Montreal, right?
Exactly.
Yes, all right. And more or less. And he specializes in critical approaches to the study of public policy. And I will now turn to him for this talk, Absent Citizens No More, Advancing Disability Justice in Canada. Michael, c'est à toi.
Merci, Daniel. Merci, Daniel. I took the liberty of changing the title, which is what a lot of academics do. Je suis ravi d'être parmi vous cet après-midi. Really pleased to be with you. Thank you to Danielle, the Miss Director, and the crew from the Institute for the warm welcome to my hometown. Thanks as well to the Eakin family for supporting the fellowship and my time here. Not one, but two members of the Eakin family are here, so thank you, Gail, and thank you, Laurel, if I wasn't nervous before. And thank you for taking the time to attend in person, and I think there are some people online, at least I believe there are. So thank you, whoever's on YouTube or live stream. I wanted to say as well, as a settler on these lands, that I'm conscious of the harms and trauma experienced by Indigenous people in the name of settler dispossession, civilization, and reconciliation, and of my complicity as a settler in these harms. Claudette Commanda, an Algonquin elder from Kitigan-Zibi, which is not far from where I live in Ottawa, asks, and I quote, "Are they ready to give us back our land?" There has to be absolute action behind it, not just saying that we're scoring a brownie point on our Truth and Reconciliation Commission report card. There's much more to just words, end quote. So my brief words today are not a substitute for collective action that needs to be taken. I also, as an access issue, wanted to describe myself. I am a white, non-disabled man, about 6 feet tall, with thinning brown hair and a trim goatee. I'm wearing round tortoise shell glasses and a blue and white checkered shirt, a navy blue button-down cardigan, and gray pinstripe pants. My shoes are orange with black and white checks, and they were bought on sale. I identify as someone with privilege, lots of privilege, including the privilege of being a tenured male academic in the university. So I intervene in this space with some trepidation as someone who does not claim a lived experience of disability. It's important I say that. Since I'm interested in what some people have tried to think about as a process of unknowing disability, as a non-disabled person, unknowing the harmful ideas about disability that circulate in our culture, that circulate in our politics and in society. I'm going to take about 35 minutes, and Danielle's going to give me a warning. And hopefully we can get to some questions as well from folks here and folks online. La conférence sera en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions en français, s'il vous plaît, vous pouvez poser. Je vais essayer de répondre en français. And if not, Danielle's going to help me. The slide, I'm going to describe slides. So this first slide, the black and white image features 4 disability activists, including Francine Arsenault, Jerry McDonald, and Laurie Beachill. 2 of the activists are seated in wheelchairs to the left of the image. Parliament Hill is behind them, and they're at the Canadian Council on Disabilities Diary Readathon. No year is identified in the pic that I could find, but it's from a while back. There you go. Sorry, I have to change. So a note about access. I'm going to describe images. This is something that happens in a lot of disability spaces. It's important I do that. It takes time. Sorry. It's important for some folks who might have issues with vision issues. That image, which I absolutely love, is by an artist named Judith Scott. I'm not sure if folks have heard of her. She was institutionalized for about 35 years and lived with Down syndrome and deafness. And she was finally busted out of her institution by her twin sister and went on to become a much celebrated artist. In the image, she's facing the left of the screen, also in black and white, and is holding a cocoon-like object that she created. That's almost about more than half her size. She was known as what people call fiber artist. She worked with a lot of materials, and I encourage you to take a look at some of her work. It's phenomenal. I also want to talk about comfort in the space. That means do whatever the heck you need to do to feel comfortable in this space. And that means if you have to get up, if you have to use the bathroom, which are to the right here, men's on the left, and then a disabled bathroom straight ahead, and the women's bathroom. I'm not sure it's an all-gender bathroom. Do whatever you need to get up, move around, leave. That's okay, right? That is what it means to sort of be in an accessible space. And it's something that I had to sort of learn as someone who was not accustomed to that. And if you go to meetings or conferences, I'm not sure that happens. I also like this quote from a disability activist named Mia Mingus, which I'll just read a part of, but and that sort of moves us from thinking about accommodation, which is, I think, the typical way we think about these issues, to talking about access. And she talks about access as love and the sort of access as a form of intimacy. I don't just want to get a seat at someone else's table. She says, I want us to be able to build something more magnificent than the table together with our accomplices. I want us to be able to be understood and to be able to be human together, not just placated or politely listened to. So I hope you're getting a sense of where I'm going to be heading with some of this, but I think there is a lot to do collectively in trying to sort of move us. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about the university as being a site of accommodation. That's the overview I'm supposed to get through in 30, 35 minutes. So, you know, okay? Sorry. So I'm just going to, get to the meat, which is what I think is wrong with the way we talk about diversity and inclusion and the way disability and ableism is folded into that, what it misses. I've become increasingly irritated by hearing lots of people talk about this idea that you should care about disability because you too may one day be disabled. So I'll tell you what irritates me about that. And then folks who've heard me before know that I'm interested in emotions, so I'm going to talk about ableism as a felt politics, the way in which people have lots of strong feelings about disability, and most of the feelings about disability are expressed by non-disabled people. And I think that's a bit messed up, to sound really academic. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about some examples, and I don't want to spend an hour talking about medical assistance in dying, because I know we can, but I wanted to sort of begin at least a critique from a disability perspective about what's wrong with the way we've been talking about medical assistance in dying and what it means to sort of value disabled life. So I'm sure many of you will disagree with me. So that's the overview. Let me start with, sorry, I'm just trying to manage both. So Absent Citizens is the Absent Citizens No More is the title, and it comes from the work of Michael Prince, who wrote this book a fairly long time ago, well, that seems like a long time ago, 15 years ago, in which he talked about how disability was in some way absent from broader discussions, political discussions, Canadian politics, political science, public policy. It was an important intervention, and it's striking to see how relevant it is to the current context. He was lamenting the citizenship of people with disabilities, how disabled folks were not considered full citizens, were not able to enjoy the full rights other citizens enjoyed. I see this absence, I think, and this is part of what I'm trying to get at, I guess, and this corresponding presence that people talk about, inclusion, including disabled people, as something that we collectively, disabled people, non-disabled people, need to sit with. Because I think there's a lot of discomfort there. I think the flip side of absence is not presence. Is it progress to talk about a move from absence to presence? Maybe we need to talk about some absented or absent presence. Disabled people are critical actors who confront, I think, the limits of liberal models of inclusion that many of us hold dear, and they reveal the shaky, ableist foundations of our society and of our politics. Disabled citizens also reveal the edges of a frayed system of support, of care, and confront feel-good narratives. We have lots of feel-good narratives in Canada. Feel-good narratives of Canada as a haven for universal health care, tolerance, racial tolerance, a beacon for other countries, boasting a generous, robust welfare state. Lots of those claims can be challenged, I think, quite vigorously. The other part for me is from the kind of cultural side of things, I guess. And I'm thinking here about how disability has been mobilized in our culture as a punchline, as a metaphor, as an object of fascination. I mean, I've done a fair bit of work on autism, and in the field of autism, people were really irritated. I'm irritated. Lots of people get irritated have been irritated about the main autism organizations using a puzzle to represent autism. And Autism Speaks, this organization. And the puzzle metaphor is really problematic because it suggests that autistic people are somewhat puzzling. We don't understand autistic people. Let's study them. I think this sort of tells us what is fairly problematic about the way disability is understood. Either disabled people serve as some sort of inspiration, some people call it inspiration porn for others. They succeed despite their disability, they overcome their disability, they're superhuman athletes, or they're objects of scorn and pity and shame, right? Talk about feelings. So the main argument I want to advance is that disability and ableism are experienced at multiple intersections, what that means, and that they're collectively felt and experienced. And also, and sounding a bit like a pointy-headed academic, but the focus, and this is drawing on the work of Jasbir Puar, who is a fairly significant scholar in critical race theory, and she has done a really good job of kind of laying some of this out in her recent book. A focus on rights and a focus on inclusion, which is, again, some of the bedtime stories we tell ourselves, reproduces a privileged, rights-bearing subject. And it really kind of reinforces that model and neglects the way in which disability is not experienced as a single issue for people. So I want to suggest that disability justice, a model of disability justice, allows us to appreciate the way in which theories of power demand engagement with what approaches that disrupt convention, upend normalize ways of thinking about, of being in the world. I'll move next. Sorry. So what is wrong with inclusion? What is wrong with diversity? Well, first, it focuses on, I think, anyway, we can talk about this for a long time. It focuses on the act of the person doing the including. Okay? It promises to promote an ideal of inclusion promised by the very institutions that have maintained practices, active practices of exclusion. It promotes a view of inclusion that can be reduced to best practices, action plans. How many times have we heard all this? Institutional performance measures, how are we doing on our EDI plan? And Sarah Ahmed has talked about this in some of her work. Diversity and inclusion can function as a containment strategy. So by promoting an ideal of inclusion by those very institutions that have maintained active practices of exclusion, you can see how people who call themselves EDI champions or whatever you want to call that, people who are active in that field often ignore and forget about the perspectives offered by an analysis of ableism. Think about this place. We're at the University Club. We're at the university-ish. The university is a space that reproduces ableist views every day of the week, right? A lot of people experience it. Think of the discourse of excellence. Think of the discourse of competitiveness, hyper-competitiveness to get into university, of course. All of these elite ways of knowing. These are elite ways of knowing, elite ways of understanding what it constitutes knowledge. The regime of accommodation that requires students to demonstrate their moral deservingness, the paperwork, the official diagnoses, the tests. And yet, I hear all the time some of the backroom chatter from my colleagues in the halls of the university that, oh, you know, everyone wants an accommodation, right? If you want to feel like you belong in this place, you need to, in some ways, overcome your disability. That is the message, I think. It also promises a view of inclusion that can be reduced, I said, to those best practices. And so there's a lot of talk about inclusion in the university and in other institutional spaces. But what gets lost in much of this is an appreciation for how people experience ableism and if they have a lived experience of disability in different ways depending upon their gender, their race, their class location, right? So it's not surprising that a lot of white people are doing work in EDI and not really appreciating that experience. And I'm not saying, I want to get to that in a second, it's not just about saying race plus gender plus class plus disability, which is kind of a shorthand for a lot of people. It's a little more messy because if you think about the way in which those categories kind of mutually constitute and define one another, then I think we're getting closer to that experience. I also like this notion of able nationalism, but that's also a kind of more pointy-headed academic thing, but it riffs on the idea of homo-nationalism that came out of a important queer scholar that we were talking about earlier, Jasbir Puar, but that there are ways in which, there are acceptable ways in which people with disabilities are seen as an exception, and it valorizes certain able-bodied norms of inclusion as a naturalized kind of qualification in citizenship. So that means that it's a limited form of inclusion, because what it does is it gets certain disabled people to be less disabled and more like the norm. So we're not really shifting the norm, we're just kind of moving people closer to that norm. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but people are probably familiar with this, but briefly thinking about different models of disability, I'm gesturing toward that third one, which is more of a disability justice perspective. There's a medical model, there's a social model. The medical model doesn't sort of disappear, right? We still have various ways in which people have to engage with the healthcare system. They have to gain official sort of recognition, diagnoses, deal with whatever issues are affecting them. The social model really emerged as a way of putting the focus and the attention on the environment as producing ableism, so that it wasn't the disabled person who was the problem, it was an environment, a built environment, the lack of access to buildings and what have you, that were causing difficulties for disabled people, okay? So I just had a little bit this sort of individualized approach from the medical model. Really importantly, the focus on overcoming deficits, narratives of inspiration, very much popular. The language of cure is also really prominent. And the social model really kind of begins to usher in a way of thinking about disability that emphasizes these important environmental factors that produce, that are disabling, right? And importantly, there was a kind of challenge to a paternalistic charity model of disabled people too within that approach. But then, you know, people always find things to critique. And so what people began to say is like, wait, hold on a second. People have impairments. We can't just kind of wish those away. We need to sort of think about that, think about embodied perspectives. And the part that what I'm interested in advancing around disability justice comes out of, you know, mainly, you know, I think a lot of folks in Canada have also been influenced by some of the US-based folks. Sins and Valid is an organization that you can look up, and they do really interesting work. And what's really, I think, powerful about their work is that they think about justice in a really expansive way. So they think about also arts-based interventions. They think about different ways in which disability culture can be promoted. And they identified 10 principles, but the two that I just want to sort of highlight are intersectionality and the leadership of those most impacted. So they quote Audre Lorde, obviously, we do not live single issue lives. It's important to sort of repeat that because it's significant from the perspective of what grounds their activism. I wanted to say a little bit, I'm just going to jump back. Sorry. Oh, it's frozen. There we go, okay. So that image there features a black man in a wheelchair with his back to the screen, wearing a white shirt, a white t-shirt and a white hat, and the words on the placard there in yellow with black writing. Half of all people killed by police have a disability, and racist police terror. So Nirmala Aravalis is an important person who's helped my own thinking around some of these issues. And she talks about race, that we need to be careful when suggesting that race and disability are analogous to one another. Really, really, really important. she says, claiming that race is like disability, that disability is like race, doesn't engage the complex ways in which race and disability are folded in, imbricated in the construction of what she calls the pathological other. So trying to think about that, think about, I mean, I'm in Ottawa most of the time, but think about some of the important examples in which really, experiences with mental health and criminal justice and police violence has happened time and time and time again. People in mental health distress, black men in mental health distress. De-escalation doesn't happen, actually escalation happens, and death. How many times one hears that? Is that, how do you begin to think about the way in which someone's mental health status really intersects with their race? And in Canada, we've, in Ontario, but also in Quebec, there have been so many examples, too many examples to talk about. But we can also sort of say, and Aravalis has done some of this work, how students of color become known as behaviorally disabled, language disabled, emotionally disturbed, and then they become segregated. They become segregated in special education classrooms, medicated, and those kinds of things. So Nirmala Aravalis talks about the US context as being really an important example of this. But we can think about this also in the Canadian context. And that's what it means to sort of think about race and disability in a way that doesn't just add race and disability, but really thinks about how constructions of the racial other are very much defined with and constituted by constructions of the disabled other. One day you too may be disabled. Oh, so I don't know where to go with this, except to say, I said I find it irritating, but I'll come back to it too at the end if I have time. That image there is from, I couldn't find this seemed to be the most recent data on disability in Canada. 22% of Canadians have at least one disability. That's over 6 million people. So we know this. Much of this is sort of mentioned and discussed. So what is, I guess, what's problematic about that? I think first is that it assumes disability as a site of dread and fear. I think it reveals also the limits, for me anyway, of projects of social solidarity, so that the only way in which anyone can care about disability is by imagining themselves as potentially disabled. And one can say that's possible, indeed, if you believe, the data don't lie. At the same time, what does it mean for the kind of how frayed our system is that the only way to sort of engage and to get people concerned is to appeal to their naked self-interest? That it would be almost kind of like a rational decision on your part to care about disability because, it's going to affect you. It's going to affect maybe the benefits that might be available to you and that kind of thing. And so it's, in some way, for me, it's an impoverished discourse that sort of takes recourse in this idea that disability might affect you and therefore you should be concerned and you should be engaged, okay? I'm just going to jump there. And understanding ableism, what does the term mean? Well, it's just the institutional devaluing of bodies and minds. Sometimes people use body-mind because they want to signal that you can't really always separate the body from the mind, that are deemed deviant, abnormal, defective, or subhuman. What I want to sort of push it, I'm curious if people think about this too, that sometimes we talk about ableism as just kind of ignorance. People don't really understand, and we have to educate them. And if we educate them, maybe they will change their attitudes. Fiona Campbell says ableism is a trajectory of perfection. A different way of thinking about it. A deep way of thinking about bodies, wholeness, permeability, and how certain clusters of people are enabled via valued entitlements. The images at the top, one is a screenshot of a tweet not sure if anybody saw this, but this person, Bronwyn Berg, wrote, if you see a person in a wheelchair, especially a woman, being pushed by someone and she's screaming, "Stop! No! Help! For the love of humanity, help her." A guy grabbed my wheelchair today and just started pushing me. Not a single passerby helped, even though I was screaming for help. So, sorry. Sorry?
No, sorry.
Yeah.
What happened to the person?
I'll tell. Yeah, sorry. I'm having trouble because I'm trying to. So this person was in her wheelchair. It was in BC, and this, eventually she said to the person, "Stop, please stop," and nobody did help. Nobody sort of helped in that sense, but she was not in trouble. And the point she was trying to make was that she didn't ask for help. She very clearly said, "I don't need your help." But for me, it was an important example of how lots of non-disabled people just assume that their purpose is to help someone who appears to be helpless. And the only marker of her helplessness was that she was using a wheelchair. So, and then there's the sort of whole gendered component of a dude walking up to a woman. And disabled people have also really been, I think, important in underlining how a wheelchair is not just a thing, it's an extension of them. So when you touch someone's wheelchair, when you grab someone's wheelchair, you're actually physically almost assaulting them. That's how I think ableism kind of seeps into our culture and society in ways that appear to be motivated by well-intentioned people who are I was just trying to help, right? And so this other piece is written called The Wheelchair User's Guide to Consent. Our assistive devices are part of our body. We aren't furniture that can be moved. So again, why do we need to center ableism? Because I think it begins to help us think about how axes of oppression constitute one another, how gender, race, class, ability move through and help to sort of shape those categories. They're not distinct categories. But also I think there's a sense in which collectively, I'm including myself here, there's a form of what a sociologist has called strategic ignorance, which I think is a useful way of talking about this, in which there's a kind of denial of things, unsettling fact, she says. The realization that knowing the least amount possible is often the most indispensable tool for managing risks and exonerating oneself from blame. So I think we do collectively kind of pretend or claim or work really hard not to know certain things, and not to know certain things about a disability, and not to know certain things about ableism. And I'm probably going to run out of time. The felt politics of ableism is my attempt to try to think about the intersection of disability and emotions. Obviously, disability evokes a range of emotions. Oh my God. Disability evokes a range of emotions from compassion and pity and fear and disgust. But the key for me is thinking about how disabled people are actually objects of other people's emotions. They're less often viewed as feeling actors, people with feelings, complex feelings about themselves, about their disability, and maybe not about their disability. Maybe disabled people are not always thinking about their disability, right? And Rosemary Garland Thompson kind of talks about this notion of a misfit. And I think disability and emotion is another way, it could be one way of thinking about that. How one can talk about the person who does not fit and the act of not fitting, she says. The verb misfit applies to both things and to people, meaning to fail to fit badly, to be unfitting, to be inappropriate. That's an image of you-know-who, that former president, after mocking you remember that situation where he mocked a disabled reporter? Yeah. And I think one way of thinking about a misfit is to sort of talk about a politics of what Mia Mingus calls a politics of the ugly, and sort of moving away and thinking about disturbances and bodies and movements that disrupt, that disturb, that create a different way for all of us, versus, again, trying to fit disability into a normative kind of way of being and doing. I've done, like the work I've done around autism has really helped me, has helped to shape me in trying to think about how autistic people move in the world, and a big effort made by lots of folks for the longest time has been to make autistic people less autistic, and we know that's been has been a real problem. I also want to say something about the notion of time and the time for disability justice. You know, one thinks about the welfare state. We have some welfare state scholars among us here. There's never any, there's no time to delay the retreat of the welfare state, right? Cuts have to come fast and furious. But people who are always harmed have nothing but time. They have to wait. They have to be patient. They have to understand that there are limits on what can be done, right? So, but I'm going to suggest that this is an appropriate time for disability justice, recognizing, you know, cataclysmic movements that have sort of emerged around the importance of social justice and Black Lives Matter, and all these movements kind of have thrown up these challenges that for me, bring us closer to that. Importantly, Black Lives Matter did have a really clear commitment to an integration of disability justice principles in its politics, right? Then not many people sort of talked about it, but it was very present. In disability communities as well, time is something people think about a lot, especially this notion of crib time, to say that we need to imagine time as the kind of chrononormative time doesn't work for disabled people. They start their days later. They end their days earlier. You know, accommodating and recognizing that time, they're always expected to bend toward the time of non-disabled people. I better jump. Can I just say a little, do I have 2 minutes? Yes. Okay. A little bit about medical assistance in dying. I think you know, there has been a bit of a debate. I'm curious to hear what people think about this. You know, every time I raise this in polite dinner conversation, things don't go well. But I think there's a real lack of concern for and thinking about how the notion of choice, consent, that has permeated the talk about MAID, as extending MAID, as being kind of a relief of suffering, really reinforces a trope of disability as tragic and of death as somehow relief from suffering, as if people really understand what suffering means, but lots of people seem to think they do, right? Catherine Frazee is an amazing kind of disability advocate who's been very present in this debate. And I like that quote from her: "The slings that lift us, the tubes that feed us, the instruments that fill our lungs with air and empty our bladders of urine are understood as tools for living rather than markers of a spoiled life. And their cold comfort to be offered the choice to die when not offered support to live," says disability advocate. So I think a richer discussion of MAID, and some of it has been happening, would move us away from these notions of autonomy and choice that don't fit the current sort of framework, right? And so disability folks talk about interdependence. Sometimes we can do things on our own and other times we can't. Sometimes people need help preparing meals and attendance. That doesn't make them autonomous, that doesn't make them dependent, that doesn't make them passive recipients of other people's good intentions. So I'm irritated by some of this debate. And also the notion of social suffering, for me, is really critical. There's talk about suffering, physical pain, psychological pain, but really no recognition that what disabled people are saying is, it's not my disability that's making me want to die, it's the fact that I live in abject poverty, right? So social suffering helps us to think about that. But then when it's brought up, people say, no, that's not why the person wants to die. It can't be the case. This recognition of suffering, I think that quote from Jonas-Sébastien Baudry, who's a prof here: "In our society, we help vulnerable people to die before we properly enable the conditions for them to live," pretty much sums that up for me. Okay. If I had time, maybe in questions we could talk a little bit about carcerality, but this is also where some of that I mentioned earlier, justice for Abdi Rahman Abdi was a person in Ottawa who was killed by police. There are many examples. And COVID, COVID has been a really interesting, for a lot of people with disabilities. You ask this idea that there would be people with pre-existing conditions who might who might not sort of make the cut in terms of triage and that kind of thing. That was a very live debate people have forgotten about, right? People were saying that fat people shouldn't be prioritized for ICU beds. They were saying all kinds of horrible things, sorry. And let me just jump to the end. Sorry for going over that now. So absence, I think, is not corrected by mere presence if that leaves untouched systems of exclusion, especially if it centers people who are overcoming disability or being what folks like Kelly Fritsch have said, being capacitated by neoliberalism. That means some disabled people are fit for work, and those people are sort of held up as being good neoliberal productive worker citizens. And much of what is felt about ableism, as I said, has been expressed by non-disabled people. So what would it mean to think about democratic politics as if ableism mattered? And the last point there is that maybe part of what we need to think about, a lot of people who are non-disabled, is how the real problem is with people who are non-disabled disavowing, disavowing disability because they're afraid of disability. And last is thinking about the future. Remember, I was saying I was irritated by this, one day you too will be disabled. This, I think, is where one can focus on a book by a disability activist, Leah Lakshmi Zina Samarasinhas, if I screwed up the pronunciation, I'm sorry. The future is disabled. It's radical to imagine that the future is disabled, not just tentatively allowed to exist, not just, okay, I guess there's one white guy with a wheelchair, cool diversity, but a deeply disabled future where disabled, deaf, mad, neurodivergent body minds are accepted without question as part of a vast spectrum of human and animal ways of existing, where our cultures, knowledge, and communities shape the world. That is, I think, a model of disability justice that is not about, you should care about disability because in the future you might be disabled. Interestingly enough, some of the most powerful, critical kind of work in this area is being published in places like Teen Vogue. Do not pay, that's important, right? The places in which these kinds of ideas are being given, and most of the important sort of people who are activists in this field are black and brown women who are really kind of shaping that discourse. So that part is really, really exciting, and I think the beginning of a different kind of discussion about disability justice. Sorry, thank you.